Mr. Berliner is in charge of this transportation matter.
I am in charge.
This is not fit.
It's not, unless you want to stay.
It's not fit, yeah.
You're welcome.
T&E only. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could ask you to take your conversations out into the hallway so that we can move to the next part of our agenda. Is Mr. Anderson out in the hallway still? Mr. Conklin?
We're going to be
We're
starting
trying to
with,
get that out of there.
yeah, we're going to be starting, it's coming up now.
There we go.
We're going to be starting with a couple of PowerPoint presentations, first from Chairman Anderson, and then from Dave Anspacher, who's the lead planner on this plan.
That's okay.
Mr. Anderson,
Hi,
welcome.
thanks for having me. What are the goals of this plan? We are trying to make bicycling a viable transportation option for real people, even Nancy Florian's people. We're going to try to improve safety. And just as importantly as improving safety of people who get on a bicycle, we want to improve the quality of place and life in our neighborhoods. And one of the things I hope to leave you with today is the idea that bicycling infrastructure isn't just for bicyclists. It's part of the Vision Zero effort, and more importantly, it's part of the effort to improve the quality of our neighborhoods, the quality of life that we all enjoy, and those goals are advanced even if you don't actually get on a bicycle. And I hope to explain why that's the case. Both of these goals require a high-quality network of bike infrastructure that connects people to the places that they actually want to go in the course of their day-to-day lives. So, in assessing what's realistic for where we could find locations for bike infrastructure that might actually be used. This is COG data from about a decade ago, but there's national data that shows basically the same numbers. This is consistent, not just in the DC area, but across the country. About half of all car trips are less than 4 miles. So trips of 3 to 4 miles represent a huge share of the market for driving. If we could divert even a small proportion of the trips that are currently taken by car less than 4 miles to bicycling, transit, or walking, we could make a serious dent in our broader transportation objectives. And so that's a starting point. This is a decay function that it shows basically the same thing I showed you in the last slide. The likelihood of getting somebody to select a bicycle as opposed to some other mode of transportation declines as trip distance increases. That's pretty straightforward. The longer the trip is, the less appealing it is to most people that you'd want to make it by bike. So this, again, the foundation of this whole plan is the idea of where is it in the county that you have people who need to get places that are not particularly far away from each other. Last thing I want to show you before we get into the details of how this analysis is conducted is to make the point that it's not just a question of trips that begin and end within a 3 or 4 mile distance of one another. It's also the fact that bicycling can help to leverage the investment in transit, because if you can ride your bicycle from your cul-de-sac, your house and at the end of your cul-de-sac to the nearest metro station, as opposed to waiting half an hour for the bus, that can improve your quality of life by reducing your travel time, and that can be a pretty attractive option for people that rely on transit. The first time I began thinking about this in a serious way was around 2007 when bike share was being set up in DC and Arlington. And tool design and the municipalities that were involved commissioned a study designed to try to figure out where they should locate the first bike share station. So what they came up with was a heat map. The red areas show the places that are where they thought there would be the most quantitatively demonstrable evidence of latent demand for bicycling, which is to say, where are the places in the DC area where bicycling could be the most plausible transportation alternative? They consider things like population density, jobs, existing infrastructure, mix of uses, transit stops, those sort of things. What I found so interesting about this map when I first saw it in 2007 was that you see not only do Silver Spring, Bethesda, College Park look redder than most parts of the Orange Line in Arlington, which is often considered a more urban and bike and walking suitable transit-oriented place than most of Montgomery County, but those spots on the map come out as much more hot on the heat map than most of Washington, D.C. You can see that outside the core of Washington, D.C., you have a very suburban pattern of land use in upper northwest and some of the places that are not right on the metro line. So this is the first time I started thinking about how to analyze more systematically where it was in Montgomery County that bicycling could be at least as likely or realistic a way to get around as many more urban places, including the DC proper. So at that point, Dave Ansbacher took up the challenge, which I had sort of put to him, that we should have our own heat map that would analyze this throughout Montgomery County. And this is the map that Dave came up with. It was a very similar analysis to what DC did, but it weighed some of the factors a little bit differently. And it showed, as you might expect, that the red line corridor close in down county, a lot of places pop out much more than the up county and some of the outlying areas. So those redder areas are the places that have lots of at least theoretical bike trips that could be made conveniently if there were safe and attractive infrastructure available. I was sitting at home just after Christmas in 2015 when I read this story. This is Frank Towers. He was 19 years old when he was killed trying to cross Veers Mill Road on the Matthew Henson Trail. Shortly after that, a gentleman who's 31 years old named Oscar Mauricio Gutierrez Osario was killed at exactly the same location. This is what really got me thinking about Vision Zero and the idea that we have way too many people getting hit by cars who are trying to do nothing more radical than walk and bike around their own neighborhoods. Now, I want to make another point about this. This is not just about not getting pedestrians and bicyclists killed, although that's obviously important. And I think about my own son, who's 18 years old and rides his bicycle back and forth to school 6 or 7 miles in each direction every single day, and I worry about him. And I know that every single person in this room has somebody that they care about who is at risk if there is not safe and adequate bike and pedestrian infrastructure available to them. It might be your children, it might be somebody else close to you. And I would submit to you, I've raised my children here, I'm still raising them. They're 18 and 13 now, but they were...
Never stop raising.
That's right, you never stop raising your children. That's right, we're all doing that. But I ask you to think about the idea that even if your children are kept safe, even if they are never hit by a car, the idea of raising them in a place where you cannot allow them, you don't feel as a parent that you can allow them out of the house to go ride their bicycle around is a symptom that our quality of life is not what it should be. That should be a basic expectation of what it means to live in a great place. We like to think of Montgomery County as a great place, and in many ways we are. But in other ways, and this is one of the things that we can really do something about, we're falling short. And that's a big part of what this plan is about. Again, it's not just about the people who get killed or injured. It's about the constraints on your quality of life and the limitations it places on your life if you can't walk and bike around your own neighborhood, whether you're a child or an adult. This is what 50 years of auto-oriented road design looks like. That photo on the left is on Veers Mill Road. Apparently, we could find, I don't know what that is, 6 lanes of traffic there. We had room for that, but we didn't have room even for a sidewalk. And the vegetation, the landscaping is growing into the road. So You have no sidewalk as you walk to the bus stop. In many places on Beers Mill Road, and you hear this more when we bring you the Beers Mill Road plan next year, there's 1,000+ feet between crossing points, and we have the police who say that it's the pedestrians' fault because they didn't cross at the appropriate location. Well, I'll tell you, if you have the number of people dying that we had this summer, that is an indication that the problem is not with the pedestrians, it's that we failed to make adequate provision for the basic necessities of life. This is a corridor where many people don't have access to a car. This is one of the highest bus ridership corridors in the entire county. And while I'm talking about pedestrians, one of the things I want to get you thinking about is the idea that bicycling infrastructure makes our community safer for everybody because it reduces effective crossing distances, for example, like the Silver Spring bike lane, the Spring Street bike lane over by where I live in Woodside. Before that protected bike lane was built, drivers typically would not respect the crosswalk on First Avenue. So people walking from my neighborhood to the Metro, and there are quite a few of them because the Metro's only 4 blocks away, had a real difficult time at rush hour trying to get cars to stop for them at the crosswalk. Now that that protected bike lane is there, even if not a single bicyclist ever used it, and I can tell you because I live there that they do use it increasingly, but even if nobody ever got on their bike and used that bike facility, it's improving safety for pedestrians and improving the quality of life in that neighborhood. So I think we need to get away from this and towards some of the things that we see going on in Silver Spring right now. This is 355. Again, there's 200 feet of right-of-way, something like that. Many lanes for vehicle traffic, and the best we can do for bikes and pedestrians is a 5-foot sidewalk with a telephone pole in the middle of it. That is just not acceptable in 2018. It could be different. We can have complete streets. We can build infrastructure into our communities. Now, I know, before I even say this, what the answer is going to be. People are going to say, we're not like those other places. We're not Copenhagen. We're not New York City. We're not a big city. And that's true. We're not a big city. I think this is in Calgary. But I would say to that in some ways, those cities have a more difficult time. New York City, under Jeanette Sadik-Khan and the Bloomberg administration, utterly transformed conditions for bicycling in the space of less than a decade. And they did that even though the island of Manhattan is basically spoken for, every single square inch of it. So if you can have bike accommodations incorporated into Manhattan in a ubiquitous way, the way they do in New York City, Montgomery County should be relatively easy. This is another shot down, I think, at the wharf. The last point I want to make about the purpose of this plan is this is good for us in ways that go beyond just safety. I mentioned quality of life. That sounds squishy. It sounds like a warm and fuzzy thing that doesn't add up to dollars and cents. But I'll tell you, it's not a coincidence, I think, that the Dale Drive Safety Coalition, No More Dead Bikes and Peds, those type of advocacy organizations have emerged in Montgomery over the last couple of years. The reason for that is that people are moving here, some of them moving from DC, some of them moving from other parts of the country, and when they get here, they're unpleasantly surprised to find that they can't walk or bike safely in their own neighborhoods. This is a crucial factor in being the kind of place that's appealing to the next generation of people who are going to want to come and live and work here. And I think Marriott understands this, Federal Realty understands this, we hear this from other employers all the time, that they're recognizing that this is essential if we're going to have the kind of place that's attractive, both in the neighborhood quality sense and also in the economic competitive sense. So, Dave and the staff did a fantastic job. They spent quite a lot of time and energy building and going beyond what has been done in previous bike plans, not just here, but all over the country. They started with the heat map idea that we should identify places that are plausible, that have a lot of people, a lot of destinations that are all close together. And then they overlaid on that this bicycle stress map that they developed over a period, I think it was over a year. They analyzed every segment of the road in the county to try to understand where are the places where there are missing connections, where there's no safe way to get from point A to point B. And what that did was to highlight how you might have a corridor like Georgia Avenue between Wheaton and Silver Spring that has obvious, a lot of people, a lot of stuff going on there, a lot of opportunities to ride your bike in theory. But the problem is not that there are no safe streets. There's a lot of safe residential streets, but they don't connect to each other. And the only street that connects everything is Georgia Avenue, that major arterial. So if we could identify a way to get safely between Wheaton and Silver Spring, boy, that would probably pay off in the form of people actually getting on bikes. So and this shows a couple of the alternative routes that were identified in the plan. I think Dave will talk about that some more. I think, and I'm not going to jump ahead quite yet to the budget discussion, but this highlights one of the points about why it's so important to retain all these routes that are proposed in the plan. It's not so much that we expect every single route in the plan to be built. In fact, I'm sure that they will not all be built. But the point is to retain those options, because when it comes time to implement them, you don't know whether the route on the east side of Georgia Avenue is going to work, the west side of Georgia Avenue. Even if you never get around to building both of them, you still want to have the option to have it in the plan, so when the opportunity arises, you can take advantage of it, whether it's from new development or maybe you're just assessing where's the most cost-effective way to do this and which property owners are cooperative and as a practical matter, what can get done. This represents the number of destinations from that analysis of if you establish the safe connection, how many more destinations that are close by could you connect to? And this was just from one point of origin in Wheaton. So the plan prioritizes by highest potential demand. It identifies those places, especially in that 270, 355 corridor and in the down county, Silver Spring, Bethesda. The number of miles that's proposed may seem ambitious, but I don't think that it's really anything out of line. When you look at the existing versus proposed, it would effectively triple the mileage based on what's existing, but that's not unreasonable for a county of this size with this many urban centers that could be connected. We'll talk more about the priorities later, but we were trying to narrow down the list from the beginning so this wouldn't be like other bicycle plans, just a lot of lines drawn on the map and hope that it all makes sense. We're trying to focus, and that's one of the things I want to address about the staff memo on this is the idea of the bike plan is not a CIP program, but it is important to establish those priorities so DOT and everybody has some understanding of where are the places where there's not just low-hanging fruit that it would be easy to build, but where are the places that might be difficult or expensive to do but are high potential value. I think you received some testimony about the idea that we don't want to increase traffic congestion. Well, I would argue that there's a lot of places you can fit in bike facilities without increasing traffic congestion. We've got a hierarchy of strategies here for how to get the bike facilities incorporated, and eliminating travel lanes is only the last resort. Also, I'd remind you that DC is not planning on stopping growing. They're also not planning on widening any of the roads. They're not going to be widening Georgia Avenue or 16th Street or Connecticut Avenue or Wisconsin Avenue. They're planning on doubling down on the commitment to getting more trips in transit, biking, and walking, and they're succeeding. So even if Montgomery County were to say, never mind that, we're going to widen all the roads, we're going to make sure that the cars move as quickly as possible, and we're going to continue to treat bicycling and pedestrian as secondary or tertiary, you're still going to run into those same bottlenecks in DC. And DC is still the place where most of the jobs are outside the county for our residents. The other point about this I want to make is that you might think that there's no room for bike facilities. This shows a little photoshopped example from Norfolk Avenue in downtown Bethesda. The upper left shows what it's like today. That's a very slow, relatively low volume street. The lower left shows if you put the bike lanes in, you could do that without moving the curb or having any impact on automobile travel. The condition on the right is the ultimate sort of example of how you could take this one step further and have a shared street or a Wooner. Here are some cross sections for Woodmont Avenue, and we can get into that if you want to. So Dave is going to talk a little bit more about the budget prioritization. If you want to change the way the prioritization is characterized, or you're concerned about the budget issues, we have some suggestions. But I would urge you to leave the segments of infrastructure identified in the plan where they are. If we could talk about how those get prioritized or how that's characterized, I think that's perfectly reasonable to do. But we want to preserve the option to be able to connect the places that need to be connected, that can make bicycling realistic and get the benefits for safety and the quality of life in place that we could achieve with this plan.
Mr. Henderson, thank you for your passionate advocacy. David, thank you for your work. I'm going to turn to Ms. Florine, but I'd like Dr. Orland to give context for the decision points, if any, today. What is it in your mind that you expected the committee to make a decision on, or is this to get us comfortable with this plan and therefore set up for our next session in, I believe, early October?
There are 3 or 4 issues that I think you need to come to closure on today. One of which is what Mr. Anderson just referred to, which is the size of the plan, because that'll make a difference in terms of how the next work session goes.
Okay.
A couple of the other issues are, they're important, but they're not nearly of the same magnitude, but it would be good to get closure on those as well. What I foresee is that the next work session, hopefully on October 1st, there's a whole passel of individual comments that you received at the public hearing back in July and correspondence subsequent to that, asking for, and from the planning board itself, asking that certain bikeways be either moved up in priority or certain bikeways be added or subtracted. And rather than getting into the weeds, I just did a pesticide presentation, so sorry about that. But instead of getting into that level of detail, today was for really more the presentations of the plan, how it was developed. It was really quite an impressive document, and the appendix as well.
It was impressive.
But to get specific guidance on those things now, and then do the details the next session. Because we'd like to have it, this council is the one that approves this plan, since it was
Indeed, we would.
onto this.
Ms. Florine, did you have an overarching question at this point, or should we?
Yeah, I did have some general observations at least. Right now, according to your book, 0.5% of our residents bike to work, right? So what you're proposing is to multiply that by 16 to 8%. So that's a big leap. I don't know. Hans and I may argue about which one of us is the more extensive cyclist, but I'm all for having a master plan and goals and objectives and all that sort of thing. I do have some serious questions as to what this means. You're the guys who brought us these traffic tests that we employ. You're the guys who've insisted on, failure rates and intersection numbers and all that sort of thing. You know that we have a huge population that is dependent upon on-street parking. And I'm not seeing, I had asked when we had the public hearing on this for some analysis or acknowledgement of how this all works together. Whenever I go to Silver Spring, I don't know how people can stand Spring Street. Now, maybe if you bike to work from your house, that's great. But what it does to traffic flow, where that was supposed to be, I remember from the 90s, Spring Street was supposed to be something of a collector road around downtown Silver Spring. It can barely function right now. Now, okay, it's more pedestrian and community friendly, and that's all right. But what is that doing to the math that you think is so important for us when we evaluate congestion levels? I can't imagine that it's helping. But has anybody worried about this, or do we no longer care? If we no longer care about congestion levels caused by these kinds of improvements, which I'm not particularly opposed to, but if we no longer care about these congestion levels, let's say so. And so someone please explain to me how this all works together. I mean, it's all nice to have grand ideas. It's terrific. But how do they all work together, particularly when you're talking about the you've already done it, or the DOT's already done it in some places. You have that, excuse me, that system such as it is on Nebel Street. I've never seen a single bicyclist on it. Maybe Roger rides on it. He lives closer to that than I do. But honestly, you've taken away parking and you have drawn some pretty lines, but is it really utilitarian, and how is it affecting your math in the master plan calculation of congestion type issues? I did ask for this information when we had the public hearing. It seems to be of no interest to anybody. It's of interest to the people who have to get things done.
Mr. Anderson?
Well, I guess I'd start by observing that in zip code 20910, which includes the Spring Street separated by Clayton and where I live, the percentage of households with no access to 0 cars is about 15%. So the idea that everybody is reliant on driving is in some ways backwards, at least in certain parts of the county. There are people who are dependent on being able to do something other than drive themselves around in their own automobile. Now on Spring Street, I think that a lot of the problems with congestion with Spring Street, which have occurred down near Colesville Road, are attributable to the United Therapeutics project. There was a major utility projects going on. I have not observed any traffic congestion at Georgia and Spring, and I know that intersection well because my office window looks...
I'm not talking about anecdotal stuff. I'm talking about the systems that you run to measure traffic congestion, your systems. You've got your models, right? Your black boxes. You run numbers. You assume things about people. Let's forget whether that's how people actually move. But you assume, our system assumes these numbers for transportation mobility. Now, if you're going to throw them out and say, well, we don't mean that anymore, okay, that affects a whole nother set of analysis that we have in place. But honestly, how does this affect the traffic modeling that you guys do?
Well,
And if I bring in my application to, I don't know, build the second Discovery, the third Discovery building that isn't there, how does this fit in?
Ms. Dunn?
Good afternoon. What I would say is, so when we currently have under our APFO and our transportation analysis is that projects come in and they have to do a delay analysis for intersections. And they look at that delay, and then we have a list of mitigation if in fact you do have an intersection that your project is going to increase the delay. It can already be delayed to a certain level, but if your project is going to cause that delay to be over the threshold we deem as acceptable, and it is different in different locations, in our downtowns, it's a significant delay because we expect people to not be whizzing through the downtowns. We have a list of mitigation, and in those list of mitigations, we really point you to travel demand issues and trying not to widen the roadway. The last thing that is listed is what the board would like to approve for your mitigation is anything that affects the roadway.
I'm not proposing that you widen anything. I'm just pointing out you're taking away things.
Well, I think as we
there's
go...
no reduction of capacity on Spring Street. That's my point.
Just generically, you're taking away things. You're taking away lanes that could be assumed for one thing or another. Glenn, am I off base here? If I'm off base, fine.
You're about 50% off base.
50% off. Well, that's not too bad.
Better than that.
Very good.
Most discussions,
Oh, come on.
It's a good day.
as in most discussions, everyone's right to some degree. The lanes that have been created, for the most part, don't take away capacity at the intersections,
Yeah.
which is where we actually measure whether or not
Okay.
we're at capacity. So yes, Spring Street has one less lane than it used to. Used to be a 4-lane road, now it's basically a 2-lane road. But the important thing is what happens at the intersections at Georgia Avenue, Colesville Road, at 16th Street. And if the same number of lanes are there now as there were before, and I think in most cases that's the case, maybe not, few it's not, then there's no difference really, because we measure capacity now, didn't used to, now, in the last several years, just strictly at the intersections.
At the intersection, okay.
And so it's to that degree, it's not an issue. The issue I bring up in the packet is that there may be situations that come up where to be able to fit a high-quality, low-stress bike lane or bike facility in might lead towards taking away a lane even at an intersection. And even there, in many cases, it might be possible without having a negative impact on the local area review standard, but in some cases it might. And so that's why I'm saying that the plan even ought to just even say that there will be no taking away of lanes if it causes an intersection to fail the test.
Okay.
And I don't think that's in the plan now. I think, but frankly, I don't
One of
think
the
that would.
decisions you were asking us to make today?
Yeah, that's one of them. You can come back, obviously we have another work session, so you can come back to that, but that's one of them. But I think even if you did that, the overwhelming number of cases.
It's not an issue?
It wouldn't be an issue.
Okay, well, that's a helpful answer. Thank you, Glenn.
And I would just offer the friendly amendment to that suggestion, which is to say that it should be compliant with whatever the then existing SSP says. Because the SSP says you're supposed to balance automobile level of service with bike and pedestrian level of service in urban areas. So, it just depends on what the relevant context is. But I don't object to the idea of saying that the bike facility, in combination with whatever else is going on in that segment of the road, has got to satisfy.
Can't cause a failure.
Right.
Okay.
Under the standards of the then existing SSP, because as I say, the SSP today in 2018 says that in some cases you should not widen the road, even if that causes more vehicle delay, because it would cause an unacceptable level of service for bicyclists and pedestrians. For example, by increasing the amount of time it takes to walk across the intersection such that you can't make it across in the light cycle safely.
I don't think the SSP says that. And the board's policy has been, when you approve a development, you're looking at things other than widening a road, that sort of thing. That's the board's prerogative. But in terms of the standard there's a clear standard. I mean, which of course I'm not forgetting off the top of my head, Pam knows it. For each of the metro station policy areas, it's a certain number of seconds delay at the intersection. And it's either going to meet that number or not. It's a number. It's not just sort of a fuzzy, gauzy thing. But Mr. Anderson's right, Casey's right, next council is going to look at the SSP again in 2 years. You could decide to make that congestion level even higher if that's where the council is. It isn't necessarily today's standard that counts. It's whatever the standard is that the legislative body has set at that particular point in time.
Ms. Dunn, more from you, or do we turn to David at this point?
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's fine, Dave.
And Dave, let me again compliment you. I did privately. You really did great work on this.
Thank you very much. It's been a lengthy process, but we're very excited to be here today. So I'm here to talk about the cost estimation. I think you have two numbers in your packet. First, OMB has costed the plan out at about $3 billion. Council staff is arguing that it's more like $6.5 billion. And I think we're here to say why we think it's actually quite a bit less than either of those numbers. So first of all, there's the so-called Tier 5 bikeways. These are the 60% of the bikeways that are identified in the plan that would occur beyond the life of the plan. They're not intended to be a promise to the community to be constructed within the life of the plan. They're solely intended to be in the plan in the event that an opportunity arises that we can't foresee. And this happens all the time. So for example, I'm just going to go through a couple of projects that SHA is implementing where there's a bikeway that SHA will be building. So Maryland 355 at West Old Baltimore, they're building a shared use path. The board reviewed this last Thursday of about 1,600 feet. We might not get that if this wasn't otherwise in the plan.
Yeah, and if I could just underscore that, SHA's guidelines say that they are supposed to build any bike and pedestrian infrastructure that within the limits of their road project, if it's in the local land use plans. They loosen it up a little bit, and so now, unlike until a couple of years ago, it said, if it ain't in the plans, it's not our problem. They did, to be just fully honest about this, they now acknowledge that sometimes they should build a bike or a pedestrian facility even if it's not named in the master plan. But the fact is, and Pete Ron has said this to me in so many words in connection with a couple specific projects. Well, if it isn't in the plans, how can you expect us to shoulder that burden? So the reason to leave all this stuff in there is not because we're promising to build $1.9 billion of it or all this mileage. It's because when there is a road project, and nobody can really predict today what road projects will be built over the next 10, 20, 30 years, we want to make sure that that gets incorporated. And usually that can be done at relatively limited cost because you're already ripping up the road to do something else.
Mr. Conklin, you good with that?
Yes, it does set a framework for future project definition.
Okay.
So there's a couple of such projects, but, one is the potential for the I-495, I-270 managed lane study, which of course has a lot of impacts, but if it is to go forward, it provides, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get great bicycling and walking connections across the freeways. They're generally abysmal today. And so this would be an opportunity, and the master plan would provide direction to the state on that. So those Tier 1 or Tier 5 bikeways are about $2 billion. Another $1.8 billion is about 23 projects. They're essentially rural road safety projects, shoulders. So we have lots of shoulders in the county, roads with shoulders, roads without shoulders. Darnestown Road on the left here has very narrow shoulders. You can see trees right up against the road. You can see utility poles. We have a lot of data through our Vision Zero project now. We know that about 40% of the fatalities and severe injuries on rural roads result from collisions with fixed objects. People are running off the road. Providing shoulders helps to reduce and provide some ability for people to recover before they hit those objects.
Those bike collisions or driver?
Driver collisions, excuse me. Almost 100% driver collisions. So if we're going to...
Stop you every now and then to ask Mr. Conklin questions, in part because Vision Zero is fundamentally a DOT-led project. Do you accept the premise that bike infrastructure is a plus for pedestrians?
We've had conversations with this in the development of the plan. We continue to have some concerns about the interactions between the bike facilities and pedestrian facilities in urban centers. But by and large, issues like you're looking at here, shoulders have always been proposed as a highway safety benefit, and they also help accommodate bicycle travel. In the budget climates we've been in, there haven't been a lot of projects specifically to design shoulders and add them to these roads. Nor does everybody agree that these are the right things to do, but from a safety perspective, there's no question that having a more roadside to prevent the run-off-the-road collisions is helpful for those types of situations, and that it helps create a safe bikeable area.
Thank you.
So the idea here is that we simply want these recognized also as bikeways, so when we go to implement, when we go to implement the shoulders, that bicycling is considered. We have a very robust recreational bicycling community in the rural areas. Again, that's about $2 billion.
We could use some repaving of those rural roads, too. Big time. Montevideo.
The cost estimate
Got to be done.
says that about $500 million would be covered by development approvals. For example, the Apex building in Bethesda is installing part of a future trail or tunnel for the Capitol Crescent Trail. The Solve Centers in White Flint is putting separated bike lanes on Wood Glen Drive, extending the existing bike lanes to Marinelli Road. These are accounted for in the in OMB's cost estimate, and we believe that they should not be considered part of the cost of implementing the plan.
I should mention that Glenn's
OMB, do you have any comments with respect to that?
I think our comments relate to more global issues, and I'm not sure which particular line you're pulling out, because this is organized a little differently than the way we had it. I don't recall a Tier 5, but we can talk about that. I mean, there may well be some things that they now think could be
Developers
in a
would-
private manner. I
Yes.
think Glenn raised a question of whether that was actually realistic, and/or when you lose the impact tax credits, you might have, the impact tax revenues you would have gotten, is that a gain? I am generally all supportive of anybody else paying for these things. If we can get the state to do it, for instance, that's always sounds like a good deal. So our comments were more global.
Did you take into account the state paying for these
I don't know about these particular ones. There was a segmentation that's outlined in here about some to be paid for publicly versus private. And that was discussed in detail with DOT.
Well,
Where is that where is this discussion of money in here, in the plan itself? This book?
well, on that might be a good time to point out that
There isn't one.
there isn't one, and guess
Okay.
what? The-
Fine.
Well,
I've been looking for
but
it.
I need to remind you that the council approved the updated master plan of highways 2 months ago with about 30 seconds of discussion, and nobody expressed any desire to see a cost estimate for what it would cost to build out the road network. So if people want to talk about what the cost of bikeways is, that's fine, but I'm just saying it is a reflection, I think, of the
Yeah.
way that we think about these things, that suddenly everybody wants to go through every possible segment, assuming every single bikeway is ever built, when nobody has ever even asked the question about the road.
I think that's an important point, and I wanted to raise that because it's not in here, the money side of it.
Well,
And we did approve the master plan of highways, and let's agree, there will be, continuing to be arguments about building all that out.
And I,
That's a set of budget priorities, as is this. I think what David said earlier, though, I just had to giggle about, which is that these were promises within a certain span of time. That's what you said. And
That is correct.
right. And the question is, what is that span of time? I don't think we're talking about a 6-year CIP. I think we're talking about like the ultimate build-out of Montgomery County, presumably. You would like us perhaps to do it tomorrow. So other people would like to build other things tomorrow. There are transit people who want to build all that tomorrow. Yeah, sure, but you have to balance it all out. But I don't think this should be based on the fiscal analysis. I know Glenn has everyone, sure, it costs a lot of money, we don't have it, okay. But this is a policy direction conversation, more than a fiscal conversation, except for Mr. Orland.
no, it's more than that.
Well, that's your position,
No, it's-
but you're not the member of county
Well,
council.
I'll have a lot to
That's
say when
other-
this is done, but just on the point of the master plan of highways, the master plan of highways, virtually all the changes in that plan were changes in classification. There were no proposed new roads. There were no proposed added
There are
lanes.
existing roads that still haven't been
There were- there-
constructed.
there-
There's a
there were-
cost to
There were a
that.
few situations where that plan recommended deleting roads. So in fact, it had a negative fiscal impact in terms of difference. So that's why it's an apples to oranges change here. I mean, here we're talking about building out bikeways for the rest of the county at build-out. This is not about what's going to happen in the next 20 years, the next 40 years. It's about build-out, just like every master plan is. When you did Chevy Chase, when you did Bethesda CBD, you didn't say, well, what are the facilities that are needed in the next 20 years? You said, what is in the master plan in the way of all these improvements, and what's the cost of that, and is it affordable? That's what we're talking about here as well.
Right.
But
Reamer?
let's wait till this is all done.
Can we,
Focus on that issue?
what I'd like to do is hold on it until we get to that issue, because we keep being eager to get there.
I
So,
mean, I can.
if you could wait. David, are you?
I'll keep going. I've got a couple more slides. I guess I would just say.
One important thing on this, sorry, but Glenn's memo talks about impact tax, getting credit for impact taxes. I think that's not, I think that's a little bit of an oversimplification. DOT's position, as I understand it, is that if you add capacity, you get credit against your impacts. If you don't add capacity, you don't. And what that means is, in this type of situation, if you are putting a bike lane or a protected bike lane in front of your property in the existing right-of-way, you're not going to get impact tax credit for that. If you were to build a multi-use path that basically effectively expands the transportation corridor or segment or cross-section, or whatever you call it, then you're going to get credit. I think typically in these type of areas, the tunnel under Wisconsin Avenue is a little bit of a special case, but these bike lanes, protected bike lanes in front of office buildings are typically not going to be eligible because they don't have capacity. But Chris can correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, the impact tax credits are specifically about whether the facility's adding capacity or not. So it would have to be demonstrated to connect to a planned transportation network. It's hard to say it's a case-by-case analysis of whether they meet the criteria for the credits or not.
Okay, let's keep moving, guys.
Into the weeds.
So about $400 billion of the cost estimate is existing master plan bikeways. They're already county policy to implement. Some of them are recent master plans, such as the Bethesda Downtown Plan and the Greater Littonsville Sector Plan. So this plan is not adding bikeways in all those areas. There's also a number of shared use path, off-road paths that double as sidewalks. There's about 450 miles of recommended shared use paths. So, there's been a lot of talk about doing a pedestrian master plan. The idea is that, only perhaps for the shared use paths, only part of the cost of, should be assigned to the bicycle master plan. And then there's network redundancy. Chair Anderson talked about how there's many different bikeways. Some are, like, for example, paralleling Georgia Avenue between Aspen Hill and Glenmont. On the west side of the road, we have a recommendation for what's called a neighborhood greenway using local streets. On the right side of the road, a shared use path, which might be a little bit more expensive. We might opt to go ahead and build the neighborhood greenway first. And we might determine that we don't want to move forward with the shared use path on the east side of Georgia Avenue for whatever reason. Many projects might be deemed infeasible, again, for a variety of reasons. But we built network redundancy into the plan, anticipating that some bikeways would not be buildable. So this didn't quite come out as I had intended, but anyway, there's supposed to be some numbers here. The idea is the actual bikeway master plan, is, in our estimation, is less than $1.9 billion. And if you take into consideration that shared use paths are shared facilities with walking and the network redundancy effect, we believe it's less. And that's what I have.
Does OMB care to, is OMB urging us, is the administration urging us to reduce the scope of this plan?
I think that the concern we have is there are multiple audiences for master plans. So one audience might be SHA. Another very real audience, though, is the community. And part of the question is, what is the expectation that is built? These are very aspirational plans. That is not always clear to the public. How many times have you heard it's in the plan? Why don't we have it? And I think particularly this plan has specific timeframes identified, which I don't recall seeing before. And
That's
it's,
a separate issue.
yeah,
Where is
but
that?
That's a separate issue.
Okay.
We'll get to that.
But I think that we're supportive of working together on bikeways. We look at ped bikes as together. We consider them together because oftentimes bicycle facilities are used by walkers. That's how they're budgeted, is together. So I don't think that we're per se saying that it has to be scaled back, but it has to be somehow communicated in a way that's realistic for people's expectations. I agree, it's more of a, this is what we hope to get to. But for people to not have an understanding of a realistic time frame, I think, is a disservice and sets us all up to fail every day of the week.
Mr. Conklin?
I would agree with that assessment, that the plan does a very good job at achieving the objective that they set out to achieve, which is to define a long-range, world-class bike network.
Do you embrace a world-class bike network for Montgomery County?
I think some of that depends on the time frame. Would you rather have a widespread bike network and then work toward world-class, or do you want to build to world-class in each segment? That's a strategy element that I think we have a lot of talking to do about in implementation. And the fiscal component will drive some of that, how much we can get by when and of what quality. But by and large, I think the recommendations in the plan are of the nature that we support in terms of spreading bike accessibility and creating a low-stress network that connects our activity centers, which is an important objective and works towards many of the goals we're looking to.
Ms. Dunn, you seem eager to add.
I would just want to add that I think one thing that this has, this should be noted about this plan is that it is different than our area and sector plans, and that when we do talk about infrastructure on those plans and we talk about timeframes, it is to support what is also being approved as typically an increase in development potential. And so that conversation is very different, and what we are bringing to you is a functional master plan does produce changes and infrastructure. It's what we want. But it isn't predicated on whether more development goes forward or doesn't. This is an aspirational plan. And so I just think that that should be noted, that it is a different kind of conversation and that we're not talking about this infrastructure because it must support development that you are also approving as changes in zoning at the same time, because it's not part of this plan.
You will certainly not hear the chair suggest that we should be less than aspirational when it comes to the quality of life in Montgomery County. I've shared with my colleagues previously, I was in Portland recently, and, Portland is, oh my goodness, one of the finest cities in the world, in part because it embraces biking. And you look at it and you go, I'm sorry, Portland weather isn't all that great most of the year. It's great in the summertime, but oh my goodness, how they have embraced it and how it's changed the quality of life, how it has attracted young people, how it has created a vibe about the community that we should strive for in Montgomery County. And so, from my perspective, aspirational is better. But let's join the issue now if we feel like we have gotten to a place where we can do that. Dr. Orland, you have a different point of view, and if you'd like to have your 30 seconds to express it. No, I'm teasing you. You get your time.
Thank you. First of all, I just want to point out something which is, again, Casey referred to in terms of the priorities. I think I hope you have your plan with you so you can look at these documents, and Mr. Reamer doesn't. Maybe you can you can sit over next to me. I'll show you the pages. A good graphic at the beginning of each tier shows where the bikeways are recommended in each tier. So if you go to page 153, what you'll see is a map showing where Tier 1 bikeway projects would be. There's actually two tiers here within Tier 1. There's the priority Tier 1, which are basically those that are programmed, and then there's the balance of Tier 1. The cost of these two tiers together, the number of miles of these two tiers together is about about 56 miles. But you see how they're concentrated. It's in the Metro Station policy areas. It's in the bicycle pedestrian priority areas. Bethesda, Silver Spring, Wheaton, White Flint, Shady Grove, White Oak. You see the blotches of Rockville and Gatesburg because the plan doesn't cover those. So the costs we're talking about don't include anything in Rockville and Gatesburg. They're basically on their own on this one. So that's the number one set of priorities. Then you go in the next several pages, shows all the individual links in Tier 1. Then you go to page 163, and you see Tier 2, and here you begin to see the links that are really connecting, in most parts, connecting the Metro Station policy areas to each other, as well as a few others that are in the Metro Station policy areas that were left out before. And that's another 60 miles, 59, 60 miles. And you skip the next through several pages, and you get to then Tier 3, and now you begin to see on page 173, basically bikeways which are mostly outside of the bicycle pedestrian priority areas. They're sort of the next rung out in terms of missing links. You see a few links in there like River Road, running the whole length there at sort of the bottom left of the plan. That's 14 miles. Those are bikeable shoulders, which are expensive, and I'll talk about those in a minute. There are other examples of more rural or semi-rural areas where that are shown as bikeable shoulders in Tier 3. Then you go you go to Tier 4, which is, the map is on page 183, and you see basically some bikeways which are predominantly in suburban or rural areas. And then there's Tier 5 beyond that. I call it Tier 5. It's actually, in the plan, it's referred to as untiered. But basically, they are in the master plan too. And that's the biggest number of miles by far in terms of number of master plan bikeways is 439 miles, which are essentially everything else. I guess the first point I want to make is I think the planning boards, this is tremendous service to the county in terms of saying that this is the order in which these things ought to happen, because they match up to the shorter trips and then the slightly longer trips and the connectivity, and it sort of puts off for the very long term those bikeways which are really very, very lightly, or just leave it at that, very lightly used, or they only be used by experienced bikers. Okay, so let's get to the cost. I still maintain the cost is at least $6.5 billion, even that's conservatively low. And I go through the reasons on page 2. First of all, it does not include the estimate we had from OMB, just the way they crafted it, did not include existing bikeways that are unbuilt that are in existing master plans. Secondly, it doesn't include the bikeways beyond Tier 4, this Tier 5 projects, which are also in existing master plans. Thirdly, there is going to be a loss of impact tax revenue through credits. If a developer were to come before the planning board and say, I want to subdivide in a suburban area, and there is a master plan bikeway in front of it, they will be required to dedicate and likely build that bikeway. Those kinds of bikeways, if it's a shared use path, or if it's something that requires extra right-of-way, or even if it's just within the right-of-way, if it's a new capacity, they will get a dollar-for-dollar credit against their impact tax. So it's money lost that could be used for other transportation projects. That is a fiscal impact. There are going to be some examples for example, in Bethesda, downtown Silver Spring, some other places, where they might build a shared bike lane along, say, a Spring Street, where they're not moving the curbs. They're just basically taking a parking lane away. That doesn't take away capacity. That's true. The cost of those are minimal. So the impact tax credit that they would have gotten, if that was allowed, would have been small anyway. So I still believe that this private cost number, if not entirely that number, 90% maybe of that number, is something that would be creditable against the impact tax. The State Highway Administration, for the most part, are not building bikeways. So there's not going to be anything there to look forward to. In terms of the bikeable shoulders, Chris was being kind when he said that he hasn't seen much in the way of improvements like this. I haven't seen any. I haven't seen anything in the county CIP for the 25 years I've been doing this which adds shoulders to a road. Just adding shoulders, okay, for the sake of adding shoulders. I haven't seen anything in the CTP, the state's program, for years, except perhaps on interstates, which we're not talking about anyway. So the only way, realistically, that bikeable shoulders will be achieved is if there's a demand for biking along there, and there's enough of a priority amongst elected officials to actually build them. So yes, there are other benefits for doing bikeable shoulders. It's a shoulder for safety for the cars. I don't see it happening unless it's something that's you want to do as a bikeway. Even this $6.5 billion doesn't include any land acquisition costs. Now, I would say most of the bikeways that are proposed don't require land acquisition costs. You can do most of these in the right-of-way, but there are going to be some examples. In fact, in the master plan of highways, there was a few examples of additional right-of-way that the planning board wants to include, and we'll talk about those next time, 2 weeks from now, wants to include in the master plan, which shows a wider right-of-way. Those are going to have to be purchased. And so that's cost, which is not counted here at all. And finally, there's the thing that's never counted, which is inflation. And so all these dollars are in 2018 dollars. So when I looked at this, I said, all right, how much are we spending now? And we've had a very aggressive program in the last 10, 15 years in bikeways. We haven't been sitting on our hands, okay? The pedestrian bikeway portion of the CIP for transportation has been about is currently, the next 6 years, $225 million. Some of that is for sidewalks, so it's not for bikeways. However, we're also building some major bikeways as part of the roads program within DOT. So you take those two things into account, my estimate is that conservatively high, we're spending probably in the next 6 years $300 million or $50 million a year on bikeways. And we've been doing something like that the last 10 or 15 years. At a rate of $50 million a year, even not having any land use, land acquisition costs, and discounting inflation entirely, it'll take 130 years. Now, if you're okay with a plan which is going to take 130 years and frankly more like 150 or more to build out, then that's what we're talking about. We're talking about aspirational. And again, it's going to have an impact more than just what you lay out in money. It's going to be credits against the impact tax, that's less money that's able to be used. So my point is, keep the planning board's priorities. I think they've got the priorities exactly right. There may be, again, the next time we look at the individual ones, they may move around a little bit. In fact, the planning board itself has made recommendations for changing some of the priorities in a letter we received from just about a week or two ago. And we should look at that. But for the most part, maintain the planning board's priorities, but essentially just be honest about this and say, look, we're not going to do tier 5. We're probably not going to do tier 4. And a lot of the bikeable shoulders in tier 3 we're not going to do. Now and by doing that, you get the cost down to about $2.5 to $2.8 billion. Alternatively, and probably a better way to go, is to give the planning board a marker, say, $2.5 to $3 billion, say, and say, come back with a revised plan which adds up to that amount. And that's something which is still aspirational. It's still well more than what we're doing now. It would still take probably 50 years or more to do, but it's at least something which is it's plausible. And there's some other points to make later, but on this point, I think I'm done for now.
Thank you. I'll give Mr. Anderson rebuttal time.
There's a lot to unpack there. I'm not sure. I mean, some of the particulars are not important to the big picture question, how you want to think about the costs and the scope of the plan. I guess I would say that I stand by 95% of what I said before, particularly the idea that Mr. Ansbacher mentioned, which is it is a feature, not a bug, of the plan that it includes redundancy. And it includes segments that are probably not going to be built. Why is that? Because we don't know where roads will be rebuilt, realigned, reconstructed, added. For example, and here's where I would take issue on a point that I do think is important. Glenn said, I don't see SHA building a lot of bike facilities. There's been a complete transformation since Greg Slater's taken over SHA. If you had said that 5 years ago, I'd absolutely agree with you. It was like dogfight. Even if the facility was in the master plan, you had to beat them over the head to get them to build a sidewalk or a bike facility. Their position was that's the local government's problem, despite what their guidelines said. Today, they can and do, and they read their guidelines saying they must. And the planning board, Dave pointed one of them out, that 355 and Brink project. We approved another one just, I believe, right before the break. Also another up-county 355, I guess it was intersection, I think with Stringtown or one of those roads, where SHA is in fact building the bike facilities, and DOT is building the bike facilities. So the idea that these should not be in the plan because nobody's ever going to build them, I agree that many of them will not be built, and that's the very reason why the cost estimate is so misleading. But it would be a mistake to take them out in the name of making the cost number feel better, because then you'd miss the opportunity to add those facilities if and when Montevideo is repaved, for example, or rebuilt. So it's
Bad example.
whatever. I'm not defending it. I'm not attacking it. I'm
Rebuild
just
it,
saying,
just put some pavement.
198, whatever it is, that there will be some roads, maybe just a few of those outliers that are, on the periphery, but nonetheless, for a variety of reasons, there will be opportunities to get the facilities included. So, here's the punchline. We are in agreement on I think, mostly on the big picture, even if not what to do about it. We're in agreement that a lot of the stuff is not going to get built. Our position is that it's valuable to put all that tier 4 and tier 5 stuff in there because you want to have the opportunity. It's valuable to have the redundant pieces, even of those urban places, in the plan, so you can have the opportunity to go to option B if option A doesn't work out or turns out to be impossible or too expensive.
So, Mr. Anderson, you heard OMB say, are we creating expectations that we will never meet? Dr. Orland says, if you want to pass a plan that basically could not be funded for 150 years, go ahead.
Well, I think that
So.
I would
speak
flip
to-
that on its
speak-
head
speak
and
to
say,
that.
I understand that when people want stuff built, they'll say it's in the plan, it's a promise. I get that. I've probably done that myself before. We all have. But it is a fact, I submit, that master plans are a ceiling, not a floor. So when you approve land use vision, you say there could be 13 million square feet of development in White Oak. Does that mean there will be 13 million square feet of real estate development in White Oak in the next 20 years? No. In fact, probably not even close. In fact, it would be a big success if there were 9 million square feet of development in White Oak over the next 20 years. So the point is to define a set of options or opportunities and then set out the parameters for how we can select among those as those opportunities present themselves. I have no objection to writing some narrative into the plan that makes that clear, so nobody can hit you or your successors over the head with the plan and say, no, you promised it to us. I think that's fine. But rather than remove them in the name of making the number come down, leave them in and make it clear that the idea here is first priority is to connect those core areas. And the rest of it can happen subject to availability of funding and other opportunities as they arise. Now, let me make what I hope is a constructive suggestion about that Tier 1, which is itself a chunk of change. Now, it's not most of the money, but it's a big pot. Perhaps,
What is that pot? How much is that pot? About 200 and something, I thought it was. Which Dr. Orland suggested we were spending every 6 years now.
50 million a year is what we've been spending.
That's what we are spending
That's what we are
Yes, we
spending.
are.
now.
Tier 1 is 208, well, it's $300 million, basically, what it is.
well, here, in any event, my suggestion is this. Perhaps we should say the tiers are what the tiers are. They're a ranking of priorities. But the objective in the very near term, or the commitment that we would like to make, a political commitment we're making, not a legal one, collectively, is to build the foundation of the network that connects the major activities of the center of the county. So you should be able to travel by bicycle within downtown Silver Spring, downtown Bethesda, White Flint, Rockville, which is not ours, but you should connect to that, and perhaps White Oak. And you should be able to get between those places and within those places. And that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to build every bike facility that's identified even in Tier 1 in each of those places. But our goal, our realistic near-term goal should be to establish the skeleton of a network that can be improved over time. And I don't know what the number is on that. I think it would be a mistake to try to figure out what the exact number of dollars and cents is, because as we've been talking about, sometimes there's an option A and sometimes there's an option B that accomplishes basically the same, it serves the same purpose, connecting the same two locations. So rather than try to figure out exactly which pieces are necessary, you could frame the objective or the thing against which we all should be held accountable as whether or not we are making progress towards connecting those half dozen urban centers.
Well, I don't think there's any disagreement about that. I mean, Tier 1 and Tier 2 together is about $800 million. That's a lot of money, but it's certainly within the realm of feasibility to be done in the next 25, 30 years or less. Tier 3 is $2.2 billion on its own. And a lot of that are these bikeable shoulders, which, again, there have been some advocates for that, but I think it's actually a pretty low priority amongst the bikeways that are being planned. Tier 4 is another $1.5 billion, and Tier 5 is another $2 billion. And none of Tier 4 and 5 are outside of the areas we're really talking about, just for the most part. Again, there may be a few things we want to move around a little bit, but generally speaking, Tier 4 and 5 are not in the areas you just described. Neither is most of Tier 3.
So let me, if I could, I'm trying to allow for a full debate with respect to this before turning to my colleagues. I feel we have given everybody their opportunity. Ms. Dunn, can you?
I can wait.
Okay, I'd like you to wait for now because my colleagues do have a voice in this conversation after listening to your voices. Ms. Florine, what's your will with respect to this issue?
You know, I realize you have made a promise in this, that various tiers will be substantially delivered within a time frame. We don't do that in master plans. So that's a problem right there. There was a promise in here that we're supposed to put our names to. Do you have any idea, any clue, what our capital budget needs are besides this? What our school construction needs are besides this? This is to address 1/2 of 1% of the population. A nice thing to do, and a good thing to do, and something that we should build on. There's no question about it. But to make it a promise and a commitment that in 25 years this will all be done, is what the plan says, 2043, we'll be in great shape. I don't think that's responsible. Of all the plans, when was the last time you brought us a plan that said this will be done in 5 years? You didn't do it in the roadway plan, that's for sure. Not even in the bus rapid transit plan. Is there a XYZ will be delivered substantially? Is there any plan where we make these kinds of promises? No. The answer is no. So I don't think it's right to expect the council or the county to absorb this and prioritize this over everything else. But, you say in here the tier 1 would be delivered within a 5-year period. That's a CIP decision that the next council is going to make. Are you binding the next people on the council to this? That's the promise of this plan. This is a real implementation plan. It is not just a desire and aspirational plan. So, I think we can all agree on the aspirational goals, but, tying everybody's hands as to how we pay for things is an entirely different matter, and I now appreciate it more why Mr. Orland has been saying the things he's been saying, because it's nice to have, as someone said, what would be the perfect thing? This would be the perfect thing. But is it the right thing? I think that's the challenge for us, at least in terms of capital obligation. I think you're going to have to go back to the drawing board on some of this.
Okay, I was hoping to try and segment the issues. The first issue being whether or not we feel like the fact that it's aspirational and therefore in total, if all of it were built, which none of us believe all of it would be built, that it would cost a lot of money. Does that give us heartburn from the tier timeline suggestion? So the first issue that Dr. Orland has posed, in my judgment, is whether or not we as a committee are comfortable approving a bike master plan that does indeed have a big price tag if the county were to build it all itself over X period of time. Or do we say to ourselves, this is aspirational, and therefore we're okay with having a big, bold plan that we don't actually know how much it will cost because we don't know when it'll get done, we don't know who will do it, etc. The chair is more comfortable than Dr. Orland is with having an aspirational plan that does have dollars, but that I am prepared to have a conversation with respect to the timeline, with respect to tier 1, because I do think that is a fundamental responsibility of this council in conjunction with the county executive in terms of what the priorities are for our CIP. I think it's, so the chair would prefer to keep the total in, but ask you to come back before our next session in the 2 weeks ahead with language, one, that explains that this is aspirational, this is not promises that all of this will be built as you had offered, and two, I at least, and I don't know where Mr. Hooker is, would urge you to look at the tier 1 timeline and understand that it does feel, in this moment, at least to the chair, that you're asking us to make a commitment that we are not in a position to honor. Four of us are not going to be on this council to honor it. So to do this at the end of this term, when every fundamental decision is going to be made by a future county executive and a future council, I get the priority. We accept it. We think that this was really good work, the way in which you have phased this in. We want to embrace that. But I think you went further than I believe my colleagues will be comfortable with in terms of saying, and we are going to get this done in 5 years, and that's the commitment you're making today when you pass this plan. And I feel like that is a promise that we can't keep. So that's the chair's thought. Let me turn first to Mr. Hucker and see if you have thoughts you care to add with respect to this fundamental issue. And then, Mr. Anderson, I'll of course let you in. And Mr. Council President, if you have thoughts you care to share. I mean, you are obviously one of the biggest advocates for biking in our county. So, Mr. Hucker.
I don't know how much I have to add. I think, nearly everything's been said at this point to tee up the discussion for 2 weeks from now. Mr. Anderson, you reminded me when you were talking about the corollary benefits to everybody else of improving our bike infrastructure, of the whole discussion around ADA. That the original intent was to end discrimination and open up built infrastructure for a class of people that had been discriminated against and had been shut out of society. And the sort of surprising benefit that people found within 10 years was that so many other people's quality of life improved, whether they were pedestrians or cyclists or parents and nannies pushing strollers or teenagers rolling around on skateboards or scooters or other things. That lots of people benefited from ADA implementation in a way that wasn't anticipated at the time. And, I hope as we build this out, people find that, through the implementation of this plan as well. And I take your point about the quality of life too. And I think not just Marriott and Federal Realty, but probably Amazon would appreciate a lot of the ideas in this and feel better about Montgomery County, given that we're putting a priority on this. I hear everything Dr. Orland's saying. It's good to have plans that are practical and not a waste of time, but there's not a lot of it's not a very joyful exercise. And I agree that this should be aspirational, should be a repository for all the best ideas we can find, and then the hard part is both prioritizing them within that pot and setting public expectations, so we're not setting us up to disappoint all the public over the next 5 years. So, yeah, I could live with a lot of clarifying language that this is a ceiling and not a floor. A lot of language about the fact that we're looking for, other investors in this, whether it's state highway or private developers or others, to build this infrastructure out, not just county taxpayers. And then, I'm sure we'll go back and forth on the Tier 1 question. But to me, I would also, and I haven't had much time at all to curl up with this and react to it, but if goal number 1 is increased but bicycling rates in Montgomery County, I would refine that in particular to, while there are health benefits to that, there are recreational benefits to that, I bet the top priority for all of us is getting cars off the road. And that's the thing that leverages other savings in other areas of everything this committee does. So to me, I would really there's lots of ways you could spend $1,000 to do that all over the county, but I hope we're prioritizing things in a way that maximize getting cars off the road and increasing cyclists going to metro stations in particular, rather than just creating a better experience for somebody riding around Darnestown.
Agreed.
Mr. Reamer, do you care to add your non-vote voice?
Great plan. Congratulations. It's been a major effort for you, Casey and Dave and the whole team, and it's exciting. You set a really ambitious goal when you began. You said you wanted to create the best suburban bike plan in America. And I'm sure that you did it. I haven't read any other suburban bike plans, but I can't imagine they've topped you. So first of all, I just want to congratulate you. It's been an incredible few years of progress on bike issues and bike infrastructure and policy. And I think, you know, what you've done here has already paid a lot of dividends in policy decisions we've made, or pull-out networks. The Silver Spring bike network is a pull-out of this, and the White Flint bike network is a pull-out of this. So you can actually see on the ground in Silver Spring the true, real-life benefit of this work, and I think it's terrific. So thank you, and we'll keep moving forward. You know, what I'm hearing from this discussion is we want to see some more language about how to match up the goals with our processes and our timelines and our financial decision processes, and I think that makes sense. I wanted to engage with Glenn on a point or two regarding this issue about impact taxes and credits. You know, I think that's part of this syncing up of how your plan matches with our processes. So we'll need some language about that, so that we don't need to get into it. It's an observation. But Glenn, when you mentioned the basic point of, like, when we do a master plan for Bethesda, it's our goal to build everything within a certain time frame.
No.
Everything in the master plan.
No. If you heard that, I'm sorry if I made it.
Welcome to the Fed Committee.
What it says is.
If what's needed.
What it says is that the plan assumes that these roads, these schools, these transit lines, these sidewalks, these bikeways need to be built.
Need to be built.
Need to be built, period, not
some
by a
point.
particular time.
Well, they need to be built to match the development that's planned in the plan.
By build-out.
That's what the people in Clarksburg would say.
The point is, we do in a specific master plan, we say this is the transportation infrastructure that is needed to match the development that is envisioned.
What it says is that when you build out Bethesda or whatever, these are all the infrastructure that will be needed, and here's how much it's going to cost to serve that infrastructure. Not just the new development, yes, but it's the build-out.
It's build out, it's the existing and the new developments. How do you make
So there's some of the need for infrastructure is to catch up for that, just from the existing needs, even if there's no development.
Sure.
That was my distinction. But there's never a date, which
There's
has to be done.
well, no, there's not a date, and I don't know about this date issue, but
We'll talk about that.
there's a framework there, which is that you're trying to make your transportation numbers balance out in a plan. And I don't see that as being as relevant to this one. Why did, there isn't a specific development vision that we're trying to balance out with this plan. It's more the whole county.
It's not about development, it's about what's needed at the build-out. And what's assumed here is what's needed at the build-out are everything in tiers 1 through 5. That they're all in the master plan. If a developer wants to come forward with a project and the bikeway that's in the master plan is tier 5, the planning board's going to recommend that they build it because it's in the master plan, and they can take a dollar-for-dollar credit against impact tax, which is a fiscal impact.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the rubber meets the road, is a bad example.
Bad.
On this kind of thing, and it's a real thing. It's real.
Okay, but it's an impact tax issue. I mean, it's not a basic issue with having a long list of projects that we might not,
It's a fiscal impact.
it's a fiscal impact.
That's all we're talking about here is fiscal.
It's not about the numbers, the transportation numbers otherwise. So if we can identify a decision-making process where we will ask for credits and where we won't,
Well, the law's pretty
addresses that.
clear unless you change the impact tax law as to when developer can get credit, between the law and the regs.
and is it every time anything is in a master plan and this counts towards that? Is that your read?
I think Chris said it, if you're building a bikeway which adds capacity, it can get a dollar-for-dollar credit against the impact tax. And there's some individual examples where they're not adding capacity, you're just basically reforming a bikeway that exists, some other kind of bikeway, then there wouldn't be a credit there. And if it's in the right-of-way, in a current roadway, the cost is very minimal anyway, so even if there is a credit, it'd be minimal. We're really talking here about situations where you're building an entirely new bikeway, whether it's on its own right-of-way or not, and there's a major cost to it. If a developer is required to build that as part of his or her development, that's, you get a dollar-for-dollar credit, which is a fiscal impact. It's less money that's available for transit, less money available for roads, less money available for other bikeways.
But you're getting the bike project that is in the plan. And your comment is that, well, maybe we don't want that as much as we want whatever else we would have done with the tax revenue.
All I'm saying is, if you look on page 2, you see there's attributed public cost and a private cost. The public cost is what the county would be paying directly in the CIP to build. The private cost is what private development would be assumed to build. And what I'm saying is that most of that private development cost will result in credits against the impact tax, which is also a fiscal impact, so that should be counted just as much as if it were direct cost, because it's less money available. One is a larger expenditure, one is less revenue, it's the same thing.
But doesn't DOT have the authority to say, well, this particular one, we're not interested in building this right now, so we're not going to give you a
You have to follow
credit?
the law. I mean, the law says if you add capacity, you have to give a credit. There may be individual examples, and Chris is right, there's always gray areas in this. We have more fun with impact taxes than just about anything else.
I wouldn't call it fun, but it's work.
And it is also true, Dr. Orland, that a future council can look at this issue and decide whether or not there need to be tweaks to make sure that we are not taking public dollars and prioritizing public dollars in a way that we are not comfortable with. So,
Remember that, though, that
Right.
when we do these master plans, they amend all the other master plans, right?
Right.
So you have a project or whatever, you're looking at a location, it becomes an expectation of that master plan. So this is not an academic conversation. This is not just what a nice way it would, how nice it might be sometime. This would amend every single master plan that we have, just like that highway one does. It says, okay, this is what we're going to do. Now, as you know, we continue to argue about whether we're really, really going to do it tomorrow. Some of my favorite arguments have been that. But nonetheless, it is an obligation that we write down. And that's why this issue about priorities is important. Are we really going to make extending the shoulders on River Road out in the country a priority at some point for Montgomery County? Just because another council can take it up does not mean that we shouldn't give it serious attention. And so I would ask you all to look at this and think about that this way. I also have a simple solution for where you have some dates in here. You could just replace that by ultimately. Instead of saying by 2043, you could say ultimately, or at build-out, or something like that. That would help us all out in terms of how we consider the application of all this. It's still amends the
if you want
master
to
plan.
prioritize tier 1, then say as soon as fiscally
You know,
Can
you cannot tell us.
Work out some language?
we can.
You
That's
cannot-
why we're going to do this.
But we can't bind the next council to a 5-year capital program. No, it just can't.
Yeah,
No can do.
We've heard what you've said, and we will try to come up with something that is satisfactory.
Dr. Orland, what more do we need to do today?
Well, what was your decision on issue number 1 was to keep all the tiers in? And is that a 2-to-1 vote or 3-to-0 vote?
Why don't you think about it?
So you don't want to decide that today? Well, okay, so
What if they think about
it
it?
makes a difference in terms of what they need to do for the next work session. Do you want them to come back with a scaled-down set of projects, or are you comfortable with what they've got in here now amongst all the tiers and just come up with some language?
I personally have expressed my
You
support.
have, and
I have.
Mr. Hucker has. I don't know if Ms. Florine has.
Well, I'd just like you to give it a little bit more thought.
Okay.
Myself, at least, just some of the shoulder stuff. Not that they're not desirable things, but when you say, or can you couch it differently? Consider, as opposed to require. that kind of thing.
Okay, so, since I have to write the minutes for this meeting.
Yes.
Good luck.
Here's what I'm going to say, and tell me if I'm wrong. I'm going to say the committee unanimously agrees to keep, for the time being at least, until the next work session, all of the projects that are in this plan, all 5 tiers, and that you want the planning board to come back with not a set of dates to be completed by on the bottom of page 3 here, but to come back with some other general language. Again, the only thing I would say is what Ms. Floriner actually said earlier, which is no plan that we have does it say that, or for any public facility in any plan, does it say that schools or parks or roads or transit or bikeways need to be done by a certain time. It doesn't say it at all. So one option is just be silent on that.
I think they have heard us. To the extent to which, again, we're trying to create a priority for Tier 1 in particular, which I think the committee is very comfortable with, have stronger language with respect to Tier 1 than you would with Tier 2, Tier 3, Tier 4, and, oh my goodness, really, Tier 5? Okay?
Okay, page 4, there's only a couple other issues. I talked about this a bit earlier, top page 4. I believe there should be language, explicit language in the plan, which says that, first of all, that if any bikeway is built that takes away a travel lane or takes away parking, that DOT has to concur with that. And then secondly, that in no case is a travel lane taken away if it violates the applicable local area review standard.
You okay?
I mean, I'm just
You were okay with the
uncomfortable
second
the way
half.
you framed that, which implies that this is always about making sure that vehicle level of service is preserved as the ultimate,
No, it
you
doesn't.
know, ne plus ultra of transportation planning objectives. I mean, would you be comfortable with language that said conversely, that if the bicycle and pedestrian level of service is compromised, you must take away the travel lane? I don't think you'd embrace that idea. So I'm just saying, don't apply a double standard. Put it in that says it must comply with the then extant SSP.
I think that's what Dr. Orland was
No, I'm
suggesting.
not.
Just say
I'm
it
not
must
saying that.
No, he wants to go further and say,
Look, we tell development they have to meet the local review standard.
Yeah.
They have to meet it. And they can meet it by reducing demand. They can do it by any one of a number of non-road improvements.
and my only
But you don't let the, you don't.
today
let-
that means cars.
Wait.
Tomorrow, sort of, more or less. Tomorrow it may mean something else, and I'm just saying, leave it at the level of abstraction at it must comply with the SSP, which, you're right, in 2018, in 99 out of 100 cases, that would mean you can't take away travel lane if it drops you below F.
I think there, just to
is-
clarify, we actually have 4 standards right now. There is a roadway standard for delay, but there is also a pedestrian level threshold standard, there's a bikeway standard, there's transit standard. So you could not violate one, I think, in order to make another one also fail. It's sort of implicit already in there, so we have standards. We have standards for pedestrians, standards for bikeways. I think it's appropriate to say that the goal of this plan can't violate the SSP, and I think it can't violate it in any of those fashions. It can't make it worse for the pedestrian or the bicyclist.
Right, and
Or
I'm
the
just saying,
roadway.
don't single out cars as the one thing that can't be affected.
I think we reached agreement.
Meet all SSP standards,
There you
right?
go.
It has to meet, all
Yep.
the above has to be met.
Yes.
Okay, that's fine. Next item is goals and objectives. I think there was a commentary from the Suburban Maryland Transportation Alliance saying that the 4 objectives, that safety should be showing as number 1. I don't believe the planning board, just because they ordered it 1 through 4, and they put safety 4th, they weren't saying that safety was the least priority. They're just saying there are 4 priorities, so I don't think that's an issue. We did get commentary from Potomac Peddlers and Bike Maryland saying that one of the objectives for a low-stress bikeway network, which is the number 2, goal number 2, not the second most important goal, is that there should be a 2-mile, well, the plan says there should be a 2-mile radius of low-stress bikeway network around each transit station and around each rec center, library, regional park, and also within a mile of an elementary school, 1.5 miles of middle school, and 2 miles of high school. Potomac Peddlers and Bike Maryland are saying that, no, that's too small a radius, it should be 5 miles. I think that's way too far. I'd be more comfortable with something like 3 miles for all of these, but actually in follow-up conversation with Dave, even just before the meeting, I'm really not uncomfortable with what they've come up with either. I think maybe around the metro stations at the north end of the county, like Shady Grove and Glenmont, maybe we should be looking at more than 2 miles, because the bike shed for those areas might be larger than, because they're at the end. But for the others, probably 2 miles, and the 1.5, and 2 miles for schools is probably sufficient.
Without objection.
Okay, and just the last thing is a minor point, we said this in the other plan too, is that there's a whole section of the plan that talks about the outreach the planning board did, which is appropriate for final draft, but it's not really appropriate for a final adopted plan, so I think that section would come out in the adopted plan.
Do we have an appendix?
Well, they're gonna have to do it all over.
Yeah, I can go in the
Why
appendix.
don't you put it in the appendix?
Yeah, this is half the plan.
All right, so.
I think we've done what we can do today. We look to you to help us bridge the gaps. I think we can, and I don't think you should leave here without feeling very positive about the work you've done and your efforts to move our county in this aspirational way. Congratulations to you, and
Yeah, I should have said that at the beginning. Dave and Stephen and all the other people in functional planning have really embraced this project. I would just correct you, Mr. Reamer. I said we're going to have the best bike plan ever, not just the best suburban bike plan. I think we've met that bar. And notwithstanding what we said about the amount of money that we're talking about here to build out the whole thing, it's really not about how many miles of bike facilities. It's about the right bike facilities in the right places and trying to make up for lost time in building out a network that's actually usable and that people want to use because it gets them where they want to go in a way that it's safe and appealing.
with that, it is adjourned.
Thanks.
Thank you.